Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5340 Introduction to Public Policy and Management. These are the readings from Section 07, The Origins of Mass Incarceration and Sentencing Reform. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a topic that has profoundly reshaped the landscape of American society over the last half century. I'm talking about the dramatic rise of mass incarceration. It's really an issue woven right into the fabric of our communities,
Right.
touching on everything from crime rates and seismic political shifts to individual lives and the very essence of community well-being.
It truly is. And our mission today really is to methodically unpack this intricate web of factors, the things that fuel this unprecedented growth. Then we'll explore its far-reaching and, frankly, often devastating consequences. And finally, critically examine the emerging pathways for reform that aim to steer us towards a more just future.
Okay. And we've got some solid sources to guide us.
Yes. We'll be drawing crucial insights from two comprehensive sources. First, there's the growth of incarceration in the United States, exploring causes and consequences.
Yeah.
That's a seminal work from the National Research Council, published back in 2014. And second, we have the Better Path Forward Brookings AEI report, which is a more recent kind of forward-looking publication. That one's from the Brookings AEI Working Group on Criminal Justice Reform.
Great. So we'll extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, hopefully giving you a shortcut to being deeply informed on this critical subject.
Exactly. Let's get started.
Okay, let's start with the hard numbers, because here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite startling. For decades, right, from the 1920s all the way to the early 1970s, the rate of incarceration in the United States was remarkably stable.
Yeah, very stable.
We're talking about a consistent level, hovering around 110 people per 100,000 population. That's according to the NRC report. Then something profound and, dramatic shifted. It was almost like a switch was flipped, and the entire trajectory of the criminal justice system just veered sharply off course. We're not talking about a gradual incline here. This was a historically unprecedented explosion in the number of people behind bars. What did that actually look like?
Indeed. The National Research Council report points out that after 1972, that incarceration rate didn't just inch up. It more than quadrupled in just 4 decades.
Quadrupled.
Yeah. By 2007, 2008, it hit a peak of 506 per 100,000. And if you consider the broader picture, adding in people held in local jails, the total incarceration rate reached an astounding 767 per 100,000 in 2007. It declined slightly to 707 per 100,000 by 2012, but still incredibly high.
So what does that mean in actual bodies?
To truly grasp the scale, in absolute numbers, in 2012 alone, there were 2.23 million people confined in U.S. prisons and jails. That's nearly 7 times the number we saw back in 1970.
7 times.
7 times. This makes the U.S. rate not just high, but globally anomalous. It's 7 times higher than the average in Western European democracies, Germany, France, the UK. They typically maintain rates closer to that historical 100 per 100,000 mark we used to have.
Okay.
And here's the truly astonishing figure, the one that often catches people off guard. The U.S. holds close to 25%, a quarter of the global incarcerated population.
25%.
Yeah, despite being only about 5% of the world's total population. This isn't just a high rate, it's an extreme outlier on a global scale. It fundamentally reshapes our societal identity. And the Brookings AEI report echoes this, stating flatly that America's incarceration rate remains the highest in the world. It underscores that this isn't some past problem, it's an enduring systemic transformation that really demands our attention.
That immediately tells us this isn't a small problem, but a deeply ingrained systemic issue. But it's not just about who's physically behind bars, is it? The penal system's reach extends much further, creating what some describe as these new gradations of citizenship.
That's a key point.
It's not just the visible population within prison walls, but a much broader, often unseen network of individuals under some form of state control. Could you elaborate on how this broadens our understanding of the system's impact?
Absolutely. The NRC report highlights that the probation and parole populations also expanded significantly. It just demonstrates the vast and ever-widening net of the criminal justice system. Between 1972 and 2012, the number of adults under community supervision just skyrocketed. It went from a comparatively small 143,000 to an enormous 851,000.
Wow, huge jump.
Huge. And this large supervised population, for many, becomes a significant and often overlooked point of reentry back into incarceration.
How so?
Well, the report starkly notes that parole violations, rather than new criminal offenses, accounted for a substantial 30–40% of all state prison admissions between 1991 and 2010.
30 to 40% just for violations.
Just for violations. That statistic alone signals a fundamental shift in how the system managed offenses. Instead of focusing solely on initial conviction, the system increasingly relies on imprisonment for violations of supervision conditions, rather than offering alternative forms of reintegration, support, or maybe community-based responses.
Right.
The NRC report observes that on any given day, about 1 in every 31 U.S. adults is enmeshed in the penal system, either confined or under community supervision.
1 in 31.
Yeah. This pervasive entanglement suggests those new gradations of citizenship you mentioned. It's a concept that encapsulates the idea that a significant portion of the adult population experiences a different, more restricted form of citizenship, all because of their ongoing contact with the criminal justice system. This impacts their rights, their opportunities for employment, housing, their social standing. Long after any initial sentence might have been served, it effectively transforms the very nature of belonging and participation in society for millions.
That's a powerful way to frame it, new gradations of citizenship. It really forces us to consider the long-term systemic implications. So given these staggering national numbers, I'm curious, was this a uniform phenomenon across the country, or did different states have unique experiences? Did it paint a more nuanced picture of how these policies unfolded?
That's a crucial point, and it really highlights the significant role of localized policy decisions. It underscores that mass incarceration wasn't some monolithic national wave.
Okay.
The NRC report shows that while the national imprisonment rate increased nearly fivefold from 1972 to 2010, the trends varied greatly by state. And this isn't just minor variation. We're talking dramatic differences in how states responded to the same broader social shifts and perceived crime problems.
Like what kind of differences?
Well, for example, states like Maine and Massachusetts saw their rates slightly more than double, which indicates a comparatively restrained approach to incarceration growth.
Right. Still growth, but less extreme.
Exactly. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, states like Louisiana and Mississippi experienced more than a six-fold increase, demonstrating an aggressive, accelerated expansion of their penal systems.
Sixfold.
Louisiana's rate, in particular, grew even more exceptionally by more than tenfold to 801 per 100,000 by 2000, and it kept climbing to 867 by 2010, making it one of the highest rates in the world, even for a state.
That's incredible.
It is. Interestingly, though, after 2000, the rate of growth slowed nationally, and some states, including Delaware, Georgia, Texas, New Jersey, and New York, even registered significant declines.
So it can be reversed.
Exactly. That decline demonstrates that policy changes, when implemented with intention and political will, can indeed reverse these deeply entrenched trends. This variation points unmistakably to the impact of distinct state-level policy choices and approaches. It wasn't just about crime rates, but about how states chose to respond. Understanding these differences is absolutely key to identifying effective reform strategies moving forward. Because, what worked in New York might not be immediately applicable in Louisiana and vice versa.
That state-by-state variation really tells us that these trends were not inevitable, but a result of deliberate choices. Okay, let's unpack this. What really caused this dramatic explosion in incarceration rates? It sounds like there's more to it than just a simple, unadulterated rise in crime. It suggests a deeper, more intertwined set of factors, maybe even a societal shift in how we perceived crime.
Precisely. The National Research Council report details that the growth of incarceration didn't happen in a vacuum. Not at all. By the early 1970s, U.S. society had undergone a truly tumultuous period of social and political change. You had decades of rising crime rates, yes, but also intense political conflict and a profound, often fraught transformation of U.S. race relations. All this created an incredibly fertile ground for these shifts.
Okay.
The problem of crime gained this prominent, often alarmist place in national policy debates. And critically, crime and race were frequently conflated in political conversation. This led to policies that, whether intentionally or not, disproportionately affected minority communities.
Can you give some historical context on that conflation?
Sure. The NRC report highlights a long history of these debates, often intertwined with race and civil rights, stretching back even further than the 70s. Think post-World War II, for example. You had violent confrontations like lynchings of black veterans returning home to the South, and clashes like the 1942 Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles and the 1943 Detroit race riot.
Right, I remember reading about those.
These events generated dual demands: African Americans and Mexican Americans rightly demanded attention to police brutality and police inaction in the face of white violence, while many whites, particularly in the South, but increasingly in the North too, demanded tougher laws and sanctions, often arguing provocatively that integration breeds crime.
Wow. So that link was made explicitly.
Yes, that phrase was used. It created this potent, racially charged context for public discussions about crime, where anxieties about social change were directly mapped onto criminal justice policy.
And politics played a big role, too.
Absolutely. This period also saw a major electoral realignment in American politics. The Democratic Party was deeply divided over civil rights and other social issues. This opened the door for the Republican Party to gain significant ground, particularly in the South. They skillfully used the crime issue to appeal to white racial anxieties, a strategy often called the Southern strategy.
I've heard that term.
What's striking is that even Democratic Party platforms in the 1980s and 1990s began to echo this law and order rhetoric. It shows how deeply embedded this punitive approach became across the entire political spectrum.
So it wasn't just one party.
No. And adding to this, the NRC notes that the victims' rights movement and even parts of the women's movement, while pursuing important and legitimate goals like addressing domestic violence and sexual assault, in some ways they inadvertently reinforced the punitive direction. This often fostered a kind of zero-sum politics, where advocating for victims was seen as inherently against criminal defendants. It diminished empathy for offenders and often pushed for harsher penalties that didn't always make communities safer or address root causes. It created an environment where severity was often just equated with justice.
That's a profound distinction. It shifts the entire narrative from an inevitable societal problem to a series of deliberate societal choices. You're saying it was less about actual crime trends and more about how society and politicians reacted to perceived crime and social changes, often manipulating those perceptions for political gain. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the idea that incarceration rates went up so dramatically without a clear corresponding crime surge. Can you elaborate on that disconnect?
That's precisely the most surprising and I think significant finding of the NRC report.
Yeah.
It truly challenges common assumptions. While incarceration rates rose precipitously, U.S. crime rates, as measured by official statistics, showed no clear, consistent trend that would logically dictate such a massive increase in imprisonment.
No clear trend.
No. Violent crime, for instance, rose in some periods, then fell, rose again, and then declined sharply later on. There was no consistent dramatic surge in crime that logically demanded such an extreme increase in punishment. The report explicitly states that the best single proximate explanation for the rise in incarceration, therefore, is not rising crime rates, but rather the deliberate policy choices made by legislators.
Policy choices.
To greatly increase the use of imprisonment as a response to crime. This is a crucial distinction. The growth was a product of conscious decisions, a choice to respond to crime with more imprisonment. It wasn't an inevitable consequence of an uncontrollable crime wave. The underlying belief driving these choices was often a blend of public fear, political opportunism, and a shift in philosophical approach from rehabilitation towards retribution. This meant that even as crime might have stabilized or fluctuated, the response became consistently more punitive, leading to the dramatic numbers we discussed.
Okay, so as the policies, how were these implemented?
These deliberate policy choices were implemented across all branches and levels of government. They fundamentally expanded the use of incarceration in several key ways. The National Research Council identifies a clear shift where prison time was increasingly required for lesser offenses.
Lesser offenses, meaning?
Things that might previously have resulted in probation, community service, or maybe shorter jail stints. Now they led to significant prison sentences. It dramatically widened the net of who ended up in state or federal facilities. Concurrently, time served was significantly increased for violent crimes and for repeat offenders, often through new rigid sentencing mandates. And tragically, drug crimes, particularly street dealing in urban areas, became much more severely policed and punished. This led to a dramatic influx of individuals, predominantly from minority communities, into prisons, even for nonviolent offenses.
So how did this punitive shift manifest in the courtroom? Were judges and prosecutors choosing to be tougher, or were their hands kind of tied by new legislation? What was that interplay like?
It was definitely a combination, but the policy changes certainly pushed the entire system in an undeniably punitive direction. In the 1970s, you saw an initial increase in arrests and court caseloads. And prosecutors and judges, operating within this changing climate of public and political pressure, did become harsher in their charging and sentencing decisions. They had discretion, and they often used it to mete out tougher penalties.
Okay.
However, by the 1980s, the legislative changes really cemented this. The NRC found that over half of the growth in state imprisonment during this period was driven by the increased likelihood of incarceration given an arrest.
Given an arrest, not just more arrests.
Exactly. Rather than solely an increase in arrests themselves. This highlights a fundamental shift in the response to crime. The system became much more likely to send someone to prison once they were caught, regardless of whether overall crime was soaring.
And you mentioned phases of these policy changes.
Right. The NRC report outlines two distinct phases of modern sentencing policy changes. The first phase, from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, primarily focused on making sentencing fairer, more predictable, and consistent. They used reforms like determinate sentencing and sentencing guidelines.
The goal being fairness initially.
Right. The idea was to reduce judicial discretion and perceived disparities, making sure similar crimes receive similar sentences. States like Maine in 1975 and California in 1976 abolished discretionary parole release and set recommended sentences, aiming for more transparency in how long an offender would actually serve. However, evaluations conclude these early laws had little, if any, effect on sentencing disparities. They didn't quite achieve their primary goal of fairness. And interestingly, these early parole abolitions actually tended to restrain growth in prison populations.
Restrain it? Ow.
It suggests their initial design wasn't inherently punitive in terms of overall prison numbers, but more about streamlining the system or maybe limiting the back-end discretion of parole boards.
But then it shifted. That's a fascinating pivot. When you say the goals shifted, what exactly triggered that change? Was it purely political, or were there other forces at play that fundamentally altered how these reforms were conceived, moving away from fairness towards something more absolute?
It was a very deliberate and politically charged shift.
Yeah.
The second phase, from the mid-1980s through 1996,
Yeah.
saw a profound pivot. Sentencing policy changes were aimed primarily at making sentences for drug and violent crimes harsher and their imposition more certain. The focus decisively shifted from fairness and consistency to certainty, severity, crime prevention, primarily through incapacitation, keeping offenders locked up,
Yeah.
and symbolic denunciation of criminals.
So tough on crime really took hold then.
Exactly. This is the era when laws like truth in sentencing were enacted. These required offenders to serve a significant portion, often 85% of their judicially imposed sentence. And three strikes laws, mandating extremely severe sentences like life imprisonment for repeat felony offenders. Unlike earlier reforms, these laws were explicitly designed to, and did, significantly increase the length of time served in prison. They became a primary, undeniable driver of mass incarceration. This legislative momentum towards harsher penalties was a direct response to the political climate that demanded a tough-on-crime approach, often fueled by public anxieties and a political discourse that prioritized punishment above almost all other considerations.
You mentioned drug crimes earlier, and the war on drugs often comes up in discussions about mass incarceration. How big a role did it really play in all of this, and how did it contribute to the disparities we're seeing?
A truly monumental one. It's impossible to discuss mass incarceration without thoroughly examining its impact. The NRC report indicates that arrest rates for drug offenses climbed significantly in the 1970s, marking the early ramp-up of this war. Then, mandatory prison time for these offenses became much more common in the 1980s, cementing a punitive approach that was particularly harsh.
Mandatory minimums really kicked in then.
Yes, precisely. And this intensified enforcement of drug laws, tragically, subjected Black communities more than white communities to these new mandatory minimum sentences. This occurred despite clear evidence, as detailed in the NRC report, showing lower levels of drug use and no higher demonstrated levels of trafficking among the Black population compared to the white population.
So the enforcement was disproportionate, not the underlying activity.
That's the critical distinction. The problem wasn't necessarily greater drug activity in Black communities, but rather a disproportionate application of enforcement and punishment. For example, drug-related arrest rates for Black individuals were 3 to 4 times higher than for whites in recent years, and climbed as high as 6 times higher in the late 1980s.
6 times higher?
Yeah. The report further clarifies this nuance by noting that marijuana arrestees, who are preponderantly white, are much less likely to end up in prison than those arrested for heroin and cocaine, which disproportionately affects Black individuals due to targeted policing in urban areas. This indicates that the enforcement was not only racially biased in its application, but also strategically focused on drug types and locales that led to harsher penalties for specific demographics. It effectively fueled the racial disparities in incarceration rates.
Beyond the policies and political rhetoric, it sounds like the economic shifts in urban areas played a critical, perhaps even foundational role in this story. So the economic landscape was also a factor, particularly in urban areas that were already struggling. It sounded like a perfect storm of policy, politics, and social conditions.
Yes, absolutely. It was a crucial, often overlooked amplifier of these trends. The NRC report highlights the well-documented social and economic decline of American cities in the 1970s and 1980s, a period scholars like William Julius Wilson have famously chronicled as one of significant urban transformation and deindustrialization.
Right, the loss of manufacturing jobs.
Exactly. This decline was characterized by the precipitous disappearance of well-paid manufacturing jobs for low-skilled workers, jobs which had historically provided economic stability and a pathway to the middle class for many, particularly minority men. This job loss was compounded by the simultaneous outmigration of working and middle-class families to the suburbs, leaving behind what the report terms pockets of severe and spatially concentrated poverty in urban centers. It was precisely in these economically disadvantaged communities where joblessness soared, single-parent households became more prevalent, and yes, violent crime rates were indeed on the rise due to a confluence of factors. That contact with the criminal justice system and incarceration rates climbed to extraordinary levels, especially among young minority men with little schooling. This context is essential to understanding the deeply unequal impact of mass incarceration. The penal system became profoundly intertwined with pre-existing social and economic vulnerabilities. It exacerbated disadvantage and created cycles that are incredibly difficult for individuals and communities to break free from. It wasn't just crime that was concentrated, but the punishment for crime in areas already struggling. What's truly fascinating here and deeply troubling is that the impact of these policies wasn't evenly distributed across the population. Not at all. The National Research Council report clearly states that people living in poor and minority communities have always had substantially higher rates of incarceration. But the harsh penal policies of the past 4 decades fell most heavily on Black and Hispanic populations, particularly the poorest among them. This isn't just about individual choices, it's about systemic effects. About how policies, even when seemingly race-neutral on their face, can have profoundly unequal outcomes due to underlying societal structures and targeted enforcement.
And these disparities became more pronounced over time, indicating a growing divergence in experience rather than a narrowing of the gap. It sounds like a cumulative disadvantage at play.
Exactly. The NRC report shows that racial disparities in imprisonment worsened substantially in the 1980s and early 1990s. That was the height of the incarceration boom. Consider this. Absolute disparities in prison admission rates, that is, the sheer difference in the number of Black versus white individuals admitted to prison, grew more than threefold from 1970 to 1986.
Threefold?
And for overall imprisonment rates, which measure the population behind bars, they more than doubled from 1980 to 1990. This indicates an escalating and increasingly disproportionate impact on minority communities. While relative disparities, meaning the Black-white ratio, saw some decline after 1990 as white incarceration rates also rose, the absolute disparity continued to increase, meaning the sheer number of Black individuals incarcerated remained vastly higher.
So the gap in raw numbers kept growing.
Yes. As a consequence of these cumulative factors, the incarceration rate for non-Hispanic Black males remains a staggering 7 times that of non-Hispanic whites.
Still today, or as of the report.
As of the report, and it remains incredibly high. For this segment of the population, particularly low-educated Black and Hispanic men, serving time in prison has become disturbingly commonplace. For recent cohorts of Black men, about 1 in 5 without a college education, and well over half of all high school dropouts have served time in prison at some point in their lives.
Over half of high school dropouts.
Yes. These are statistics that should shock us into action. The report underscores that even for drug offenses, where we know the prevalence of drug use is only slightly higher or even lower among Black individuals than white individuals, and there's little evidence of higher trafficking, drug-related arrest rates for Black individuals have been 3 to 4 times higher than for whites. This points to a consistent pattern of cumulative disadvantage, where disadvantage at one stage of the system just compounds at the next, leading to these staggering and deeply inequitable outcomes.
So, is there evidence of outright, explicit discrimination in the system, or are these disparities a result of more subtle underlying factors and implicit biases? What does the research tell us about that distinction?
The National Research Council report is very nuanced and thorough here. It acknowledges that many earlier studies claiming systematic, overt bias in sentencing were undermined. mainly by not adequately controlling for legally relevant factors like prior criminal record.
Okay, methodological issues.
Right. However, subsequent, more rigorous research does conclude that black defendants are indeed treated less favorably than white defendants at several crucial, often subtle stages of the criminal justice process. This includes pretrial detention decisions, where black defendants are more likely to be held in jail before trial, prosecutorial charging decisions, where they may face more severe charges for similar offenses, and choices between community punishments versus incarceration, where they are disproportionately steered towards prison sentences.
So subtle disadvantages add up.
Exactly. The key insight from the NRC is that the cumulative effect of these small differences, these incremental disadvantages at each stage, is ultimately substantial. It leads to the profound racial disparities we observe, even if overt, explicit bias isn't universally found at every single point.
And beyond those decision points.
Beyond explicit bias, the NRC report highlights racial stereotypes, often reinforced by media portrayals of black offenders and white victims. These stereotypes operate to the detriment of black individuals in the criminal justice system. Studies on the influence of skin tone and stereotypically African American facial features show that these visual cues can, unconsciously, lead to more severe punishment from judges and juries.
Unconscious bias, then.
Yes. Moreover, results from the implicit association test, IAT, a widely used tool for measuring unconscious biases, consistently demonstrate an implicit bias against African Americans across almost all demographic groups in the U.S., not just among those who might harbor explicit prejudice. This subtle unconscious bias can manifest as statistical discrimination. For example, leading employers to use race as a proxy for criminality, assuming inner-city minority men are less reliable workers, even without a criminal record, which then becomes a formidable barrier to economic opportunity and perpetuates systemic disadvantage.
This concentration in certain communities sounds like a really significant issue, almost like entire neighborhoods are being systematically drawn into the penal system, leading to a profound social and economic toll.
It is indeed a defining and devastating characteristic of mass incarceration's impact. The NRC report stresses that the escalating rates of incarceration have been heavily concentrated in poor and largely urban African American and Hispanic communities. Studies from major cities across the U.S., Chicago, New York City, Houston, Seattle, consistently show this profound geographic inequality.
Can you give an example?
Sure. In some residential blocks in Brooklyn, New York City, approximately 10% of men aged 16 to 44 were admitted to jail or prison each year.
10% every year, from one block.
Each year. That's an astonishing and unsustainable rate for a single neighborhood. The financial burden is equally staggering. The cost to taxpayers to house those incarcerated from just these blocks could reach up to $3 million annually per block.
$3 million per block.
Yes. This intense concentration means that incarceration at the neighborhood level is deeply entangled with a large number of pre-existing social disadvantages. Things like high levels of poverty, a lack of economic opportunities, elevated rates of violence. It's not simply an added problem, it becomes another layer of systemic hardship. The report concludes that even if incarceration has no unique statistical effect on community indicators beyond these pre-existing conditions, the sheer concentration of punishment layered onto existing social inequalities constitutes a severe hardship for these neighborhoods. It fundamentally reshapes the social fabric, fragments family structures, undermines the economic viability of these communities, and perpetuates cycles of disadvantage that are incredibly difficult to break. It's like pouring salt on an open wound.
We've looked at how people get into prison and the broader impact on communities. But what about the actual experience of being incarcerated during this period of dramatic growth? What was life like behind those increasingly crowded walls, and how did the system itself change?
The National Research Council report paints a complex picture of life inside. While some studies actually show an improvement in certain indicators of order and safety within prisons, like declines in riots, homicides, and suicides.
Oh, that's surprising.
It is, somewhat, but the overall quality of life and the fundamental nature of confinement shifted dramatically towards a more punitive, less rehabilitative model. For instance, the Prison Litigation Reform Act of 1995, the PLRA. It significantly limited prisoners' access to courts to challenge conditions. It made it much harder for individuals to pursue credible claims of abuse, neglect, or poor conditions, despite its stated aim to reduce frivolous lawsuits.
So fewer avenues for accountability.
Exactly. While some metrics of acute violence might have declined, the avenues for accountability and improvement of daily life were severely curtailed. Prisoners had fewer ways to seek legal recourse, perhaps most crucially, with the dominant rationale for imprisonment shifting away from rehabilitation. to one focused almost exclusively on punishment and crime control. And in the face of unprecedented overcrowding, prison systems were under much less pressure to provide meaningful rehabilitative services, treatment, and programming.
So things like education, job training.
Declined significantly.
Yeah.
The NRC notes a significant drop in inmate participation in academic programs, from 45% in 1986 down to about 27% in 2004, and a corresponding reduction in funding for vocational training. This directly impacted opportunities for personal growth, skill development, and preparation for life after release. Prisons transformed from potential places of reform into essentially holding pens primarily concerned with custody and control, often at the expense of human development and future success.
That decline in rehabilitation, coupled with the often harsh conditions, must have taken a serious toll on individuals. It sounds like a deeply debilitating experience for many, not one that prepares them for a better life.
It absolutely did, and the psychological and physical scars are profound. The National Research Council finds that imprisonment often produces negative, disabling behavioral and physical changes in prisoners. Stress, acute psychiatric symptoms, the exacerbation of pre-existing psychological disorders, these are incredibly common.
How common?
Well, research indicates a prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in prisoner populations that is 2 to 10 times higher than in community samples, reaching up to 48% for female prisoners and a staggering 24–65% for male juvenile inmates in some studies.
65%, that's huge.
It's a profound indicator of the psychological trauma associated with incarceration. A phenomenon known as prisonization also occurs. This is where prisoners adopt habits, values, and perspectives necessary for survival in confinement, like a taciturn demeanor, deep mistrust of others, maybe aggression.
Adaptive inside, but...
Exactly. While these traits might be adaptive inside the prison, they become profoundly counterproductive for successful reintegration into the community upon release. They create a significant barrier to leading a pro-social life. The NRC report also highlights the extreme conditions of long-term isolated confinement, particularly in supermax units. These can last for years or even decades.
Solitary confinement, essentially.
Yes, and often under very harsh conditions.
Yeah.
Many experts condemn this practice, arguing it raises the level of punishment close to that of psychological torture, due to the broad range of harmful psychological effects documented. Things like anxiety, panic, hallucinations, paranoia. Furthermore, the aging inmate population, a growing trend during the period of rising incarceration rates, means prisons are increasingly becoming critical delivery sites for nursing home-level care and chronic illness management, often without adequate resources or specialized staff.
And specific groups face unique challenges.
Definitely. The incarceration of women, often for nonviolent crimes, and youth, increasingly through the school-to-prison pipeline, also presents distinct challenges, particularly concerning mental health issues for women and developmental interference for adolescents whose brains are still forming and are highly susceptible to the negative impacts of institutionalization.
So, with all this harshness and the focus on punishment and control over rehabilitation, did it actually achieve its goal of deterring crime and making society safer? Or, to play devil's advocate for a moment, some might argue that without these tough sentences, crime would be even higher. How does the research address that perspective?
That's a crucial question, and the evidence is quite sobering. It challenges the very premise of the tough-on-crime philosophy. The National Research Council's extensive review finds little evidence of a specific deterrent or rehabilitative effect of incarceration, and that all evidence on the effect of imprisonment on reoffending points to either no effect or a criminogenic effect.
Criminogenic, meaning it causes more crime.
Exactly. It means incarceration often makes people more likely, not less, to reoffend upon release. The idea that prison will teach them a lesson appears largely unsubstantiated by the evidence. In many cases, it makes individuals more prone to future criminal behavior due to the factors we just discussed: prisonization, lack of skills, trauma, stigma.
Okay, so maybe not rehabilitation. What about deterrence? Longer sentences scaring people straight.
The NRC report also emphasizes that the incremental deterrent effect of lengthy prison sentences is modest at best. This means that adding more years to an already long sentence doesn't significantly increase its crime prevention power. The marginal utility of extra time behind bars diminishes rapidly.
Okay.
And to address your devil's advocate point, while incapacitation removing criminals from society does prevent crimes while they are incarcerated.
Right, they can't commit crimes outside if they're locked up.
True. But longer sentences are often an inefficient approach to preventing crime through incapacitation. This is largely because recidivism rates decline markedly with age. Prisoners naturally age during their sentences, And as they get older, they're inherently less likely to commit new crimes. So, keeping an aging offender locked up for many extra years beyond their peak crime-committing age yields diminishing returns in terms of public safety, unless those longer sentences are specifically targeted at very high-rate or extremely dangerous offenders. For all the immense investment in severity, the crime prevention benefits remain highly uncertain. It leads to the conclusion that we are often inflicting severe harm, incurring massive costs, without achieving the intended public safety outcomes. This raises critical questions about the cost-effectiveness and, indeed, the moral justification of the existing system. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the consequences of mass incarceration ripple far beyond the individual behind bars. They impact public health and community well-being in profound and often hidden ways. The National Research Council report highlights that many inmates enter prisons and jails with a range of serious health conditions. Things like substance abuse disorders, mental illness, infectious diseases like HIV, hepatitis B and C, STDs.
So prisons become involuntary healthcare providers, in a way.
Yes, they often operate as de facto public health institutions, providing a level of care that many inmates lacked access to before confinement. It offers a unique, if often strained, opportunity for diagnosis and treatment within their walls.
That's an interesting point, that prisons become de facto health institutions. But what happens after release? Does the system effectively support their transition back into the community, especially regarding their critical health needs? Or do those gains simply evaporate?
That's precisely where the system falls tragically short, and the consequences are dire. Post-release, individuals face a significantly elevated risk of suicide and overdose. A staggering statistic is that the risk of overdose deaths in the days immediately following release from prison is 129 times higher than that of the general population.
129 times higher. Why such a huge spike?
It's often due to a loss of drug tolerance during incarceration, combined with a return to environments that trigger substance use. The problem is exacerbated because discharge planning and post-release aftercare, particularly for those with mental illness or substance use disorders, are often inadequate or entirely absent. This leads to continued reliance on emergency services, high rates of readmission to the criminal justice system, and poor health outcomes. It creates a revolving door between the criminal justice and healthcare systems. Moreover, incarceration has been linked to the disruption of stable relationships and creates artificial sex ratio imbalances in communities, particularly those disproportionately affected by mass incarceration. These imbalances contribute to the spread of STDs and HIV transmission networks, especially among Black and Hispanic men. It further compounds public health challenges in already vulnerable communities. The report emphasizes the critical need for a continuum of care that extends seamlessly beyond prison walls, linking individuals to community health resources.
How does mass incarceration affect employment and economic well-being? Especially for specific groups who are already facing systemic disadvantages. It sounds like it creates a sort of hidden economic burden, an invisible inequality, as the report calls it. Could you paint a clearer picture of what this truly obscures in our conventional understanding?
It absolutely creates a profound, hidden economic burden. The National Research Council introduces a crucial and eye-opening concept here called invisible inequality. This refers to how conventional employment statistics, particularly for low-educated Black men, are significantly distorted because they often exclude the incarcerated population from their calculations.
So the official numbers look better than reality?
Exactly. Imagine looking at an iceberg and only seeing the tip, completely missing the massive submerged portion. That's what happens when we ignore the incarcerated in our economic data. When the incarcerated are factored into the jobless count, the employment rate for young African-American men with little schooling drops dramatically. The NRC states that by 2008, these men were more likely to be locked up than employed. More likely locked up than employed.
Yes. This dramatically alters our understanding of racial gaps in wages, employment, and even high school graduation rates, suggesting they are much wider than official statistics typically indicate. For example, including inmates and analyses of high school dropout rates increases the dropout rate for young Black men by about 40% over conventional estimates. This means that economic improvements often touted in official reports don't reflect the true struggles faced by a large, marginalized segment of the population, leading to misinformed policy decisions based on incomplete data.
And the stigma of a record.
The stigma of a criminal record is another major and well-documented barrier, not just to employment, but also to housing, education, access to safety net programs. The NRC points out that this penalty is especially large for Black job seekers. Audit studies, which compare identical job applicants differing only by race or criminal record, reveal direct racial discrimination.
So
Black individuals with a clean record often face similar callback rates for jobs as white individuals with a felony conviction. Wait, really? A Black applicant with no record gets treated the same as a white applicant with a felony.
that's what some key audit studies found. It's a stark finding suggests that race itself is often used as a proxy for criminality in hiring decisions, compounding the disadvantage and creating systemic hurdles for an entire demographic group. The pervasive contact with the criminal justice system at its current scale has consequences for racial stratification that extend well beyond individuals behind bars. It reshapes economic opportunity for entire communities.
It sounds like the impact cascades through entire families and even our democratic structures, creating long-term ripple effects that undermine core tenets of society and civic participation.
It absolutely does. With profound and enduring consequences that challenge the very fabric of our society. The National Research Council finds that incarceration is consistently associated with weaker family bonds and lower levels of child well-being, including increased behavioral problems and delinquency in children. This creates devastating intergenerational cycles of disadvantage, where the children of incarcerated parents are themselves more likely to face challenges.
And maternal incarceration.
Maternal incarceration, while less common than paternal, is also a growing concern. It causes significant emotional distress for both mothers and children during separation, and often results in persistent disadvantage for the children left behind, who may end up in foster care or with relatives facing their own struggles.
Beyond families, what about civic life? Voting.
Mass incarceration has profound civic and political consequences. Millions of Americans are disenfranchised due to felony convictions. Nearly 6 million people, or 1 in 40 adults, by 2010. For African Americans, it's a staggering 1 in 13. That's a rate 3 times greater than for non-African Americans.
1 in 13 Black adults can't vote.
Due to felony disenfranchisement laws, yes, as of 2010, and the numbers remain extremely high. The NRC clearly states that many of these laws have clear racial origins, often aimed at restricting the vote of newly freed Black individuals after the Civil War. And their impact today continues to disproportionately affect minority communities, systematically eroding their political voice and participation.
And there's that issue with the census too, right? Counting prisoners.
Yes, a subtle but significant distortion. The U.S. Census Bureau's practice of counting prisoners as residents of the towns where they are incarcerated, rather than their home communities. This significantly distorts demographic data. It leads to misleading conclusions about economic growth, migration patterns, racial composition, both in prison towns and the urban areas prisoners come from. More importantly, it can shift political representation and funding away from urban communities that are disproportionately affected, and towards the often rural areas where prisons are built.
So it actually changes political power based on where prisons are located.
Essentially, yes. The very act of counting people for political representation creates a skewed reality that benefits areas housing prisons at the expense of the communities from which prisoners primarily come, further disadvantaging already marginalized populations. Finally, the sheer financial cost of this system, around $80 billion annually for state and federal corrections by the end of the prison boom, represents a significant and lasting shift in public resources. This cost isn't just a number, it represents foregone opportunities. Investments in education, infrastructure, public health, other vital community services. It's an opportunity cost, devoting funds that could have been used for crime prevention or addressing root causes of social problems, underscoring the broad societal trade-offs of mass incarceration.
Wow, what an incredibly comprehensive deep dive. We've traced how a seemingly stable system dramatically shifted, driven not by an inevitable crime wave, but by complex political, social, and deliberate policy choices. That had a profoundly unequal impact, leaving deep cracks in our societal foundations. So what does this all mean for the future? Given these profound and often negative consequences, how can we rethink our approach to criminal justice? How do we build a more just and effective system?
Both the National Research Council and the Brookings AEI report emphasize a fundamental need to reassess the values underlying our penal system. The NRC argues that the transformation of U.S. punishment policy saw a dramatic shift away from rehabilitation as a primary goal, towards just deserts or retribution, often expressed through that tough-on-crime rhetoric that came to dominate public discourse.
Right.
They propose reviving 4 core normative principles that are deeply rooted in jurisprudence and human dignity, principles they believe must guide future policy.
What are they?
First, proportionality. Punishment should be proportionate to the crime committed. This means avoiding excessively harsh sentences for minor offenses that simply don't align with the severity of the act, ensuring the punishment truly fits the crime, not just the political mood.
Makes sense.
Second, parsimony. Punishment should be sufficient, but no more severe than necessary to achieve its legitimate goals. This principle, stemming from Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian philosophy, suggests that any punishment beyond what is needed to deter or incapacitate is morally unjustifiable and an excessive waste of resources, both human and financial.
Use the least restrictive means necessary, basically.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Citizenship. The conditions and consequences of punishments, especially imprisonment, should not be so severe or enduring as to violate an individual's fundamental status as a member of society. This implies that a temporary deprivation of liberty, no matter how long, shouldn't lead to a permanent diminished citizenship upon release, impacting fundamental rights and opportunities.
Avoiding lifelong penalties.
Right. And fourth, social justice. Prisons should be instruments of justice. Their collective effect should be to promote, and not to undermine, society's aspirations for a fair distribution of rights, resources, and opportunities. This calls into question a system that disproportionately impacts already disadvantaged communities, and instead challenges us to consider how the system can actively contribute to a more equitable society.
Those are powerful principles.
They are. And these principles, reflected in the Supreme Court's Eighth Amendment rulings against cruel and unusual punishment, must complement, not be overridden by, the goals of offender accountability and crime control. They suggest a more humane, efficient, and equitable approach to justice, one that truly serves public safety in the broadest sense.
These principles sound like a powerful compass for reform. So what are some of the concrete, actionable reforms being proposed to put these principles into practice, particularly in the more recent Brookings AEI report? Where do we even begin to unwind such a complex, entrenched system?
The Brookings AEI report outlines several short and medium-term reforms designed to address some of the most pressing issues across the justice system. In policing, a key short-term reform they highlight is to eliminate qualified immunity.
Qualified immunity, that comes up a lot.
It does. It's a legal doctrine that courts invented, essentially, that makes it incredibly difficult to sue police officers and other government officials, even when they have plausibly violated someone's constitutional rights. To put it simply, if an officer commits misconduct, qualified immunity often shields them from civil lawsuits unless there's an exact prior court case with identical facts.
So which is rare.
Very rare. This doctrine effectively shields officers from accountability, and the financial burden misconduct payouts often falls on taxpayers, rather than police departments or the individual officers themselves. The report highlights that over 60% of Americans support eliminating qualified immunity, showing broad public consensus for this critical change.
Okay, what else in policing?
For medium-term reform, they recommend restructuring civilian payouts for police misconduct, shifting liability to police departments or individual officers. Currently, over $2 billion was spent by the 20 largest U.S. municipalities on these payouts just from 2015-2019. But these funds mostly come from general municipal funds. Taxpayers bear the cost, while departments and officers often face little financial liability. Shifting this burden would create a stronger financial incentive for departments to ensure accountability and professional conduct, and it would free up municipal funds for crucial public services like education, work, infrastructure.
And for broader justice system, beyond policing.
The Brookings AEI report advocates for sophisticated interagency approaches. This means law enforcement, prosecutors, courts, collaborating much more closely with social service, public health, educational professionals to implement diversion programs, problem-solving courts like drug courts or mental health courts, and other alternatives to incarceration. The idea is to address underlying issues like behavioral health crises, substance abuse, homelessness issues. The justice system is often poorly equipped to handle through incarceration, rather than relying solely on punitive measures. It reflects a recognition that these complex needs are a broader societal responsibility, not just a criminal justice one, and require holistic solutions.
And what about prisons themselves? After decades of prioritizing punishment, how can they be transformed to align with these new principles and goals? Maybe even embracing a renewed focus on rehabilitation?
For prisons, the Brookings AEI report proposes a Transforming Prisons Act to create new federal funding opportunities for states. These funds would support truly innovative programs like cognitive communities, structured environments designed to foster pro-social thinking and behavior, helping inmates address criminal thought patterns, as well as parenting classes, family engagement workshops, anger management, and artistic programming. Things like California Transformative Arts, which promotes self-awareness and improves mental health through creative expression.
So, bringing programming back in a serious way.
Exactly. The overarching aim here is a significant rehabilitative turn in corrections, shifting prisons from mere holding facilities to places where people can genuinely change, gain skills, and prepare for successful reentry. The NRC also suggests practical steps that could have immediate effects on reducing overall incarceration rates and costs, such as reforming release policies. This could involve reconsidering the abolition of discretionary parole, which allows parole boards to assess an individual's readiness for release, and expanding medical or geriatric parole for elderly or severely ill inmates who pose little public safety risk, offering a more humane and cost-effective approach.
So, looking at both the front end and the back end of the system.
Precisely. And a crucial long-term goal, advocated by both reports, is to fundamentally reduce our overall reliance on incarceration and the primary response to crime. The Brookings AEI report highlights that the COVID-19 pandemic, despite its tragedies, inadvertently revealed something important, that decarceration reducing prison populations could be accomplished with minimal risk to community safety in many jurisdictions. They suggest fostering shorter prison terms for many offenses, increasing the use of effective community sanctions as alternatives, and even strategically closing prisons. Coupled with alternative economic development for rural communities that currently rely on prison facilities for jobs, this acknowledges the economic realities tied to the prison industrial complex and seeks to provide sustainable, non-carceral alternatives for these communities.
And education continues to be a key component, even for those incarcerated, as a pathway to a better future and a way to break cycles of recidivism.
Absolutely. The Brookings AEI report emphasizes the importance of deepening Pell Grant investments for incarcerated individuals, noting the recent reinstatement of eligibility for these federal grants, reversing a 3-decade ban that severely restricted educational opportunities.
That's a big deal.
It is. This will significantly increase access to post-secondary education for many incarcerated individuals. Though efforts are still needed for the 30% of incarcerated adults without high school credentials, as they remain ineligible for Pell without enrollment in specific career pathway programs. Both reports call for more rigorous, large-scale research into pre-release training programs and a continuum of service delivery, one that effectively bridges incarceration and community support rather than siloed, fragmented efforts. This continuous support, from inside prison walls to robust community services, is vital for long-term success and reduced recidivism.
And the war on drugs, any specific recommendations there?
The National Research Council specifically recommends a critical reassessment of the war on drugs, advocating for treating drug abuse primarily as both a health and justice policy issue. They suggest relying more heavily on healthcare measures, treatment, and prevention, and less on arrests and punitive incarceration. They cite successful interventions like High Point, North Carolina's focused deterrence model, which uses coordinated multi-agency responses to drug markets with limited reliance on arrests, emphasizing treatment options, and thus achieving reduced crime and incarceration rates.
Shifting focus from punishment to health and intervention.
Exactly. And finally, and a point I feel strongly about, the Brookings AEI report strongly advocates for addressing the deeply problematic school-to-prison pipeline by critically evaluating the role of school police officers, SPOs.
Police in schools.
Yes. They argue that SPOs often engage in mission creep, criminalizing minor school incidents that were historically handled by school administrators, leading to suspensions, expulsions, and arrests for behaviors that used to be dealt with internally. This disproportionately affects the youth of color. For instance, Black students comprised 36% of school arrests in 2015-16, despite being only 15% of the student body.
So what's the recommendation?
It's a bold one. Remove police from schools and instead invest the savings in counselors, psychologists, and support services to promote safe learning environments without recourse to the justice system. The focus here is on fostering desistance, understanding why and how people stop committing crimes, by supporting positive identity formation and development rather than merely addressing deficits or punishing missteps. This requires a broad review of legal disabilities and restrictions faced by formerly incarcerated individuals, barriers to housing, employment, education, ensuring that a temporary deprivation of liberty does not lead to a permanently diminished citizenship. It's about building pathways to success, not just punishing failure, and truly believing in the capacity for human change. Hashtag tech tech outro.
Wow, what an incredibly comprehensive deep dive. We've seen how a seemingly stable system dramatically shifted, driven not by an inevitable crime wave, but by complex political, social, and deliberate policy choices. Choices that had a profoundly unequal impact on minority communities. From the harsh realities of prison life and the decline of rehabilitation to the hidden costs on health, families, our democratic fabric. The story of mass incarceration is one of intricate and often unintended consequences, revealing deep cracks in our societal foundations and challenging our very notion of justice.
And it underscores that while the challenges are immense and the system deeply entrenched, there are clear, evidence-based pathways forward, rooted in those principles we discussed: parsimony, proportionality, citizenship, and social justice. The key really is to move beyond simply controlling crime through punishment, to fostering genuine community well-being and ensuring that our justice system reflects a commitment to human dignity and equitable opportunity for all, recognizing that punitive measures alone are insufficient and often counterproductive to true public safety.
That's a powerful and hopeful thought to leave us with. It's a reminder that these policies affect all of us, directly or indirectly. They shape the very nature of our society and what we value. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of mass incarceration and sentencing reform.
It's been a privilege, a really important conversation.
Indeed. What stands out to you from today's discussion? We hope this deep dive encourages you to continue exploring these critical issues and consider how we can collectively build a more just society, one where the principles of justice and human dignity truly guide our actions and reforms.